Chapter 1. Whispers in the hall. The spring breeze fluttered through the open windows of the stately Elmridge Manor, carrying with it the scent of blooming lilacs and fresh-cut grass. Inside, the grand hallway was abuzz with the soft murmurs of the arriving guests, each elegantly dressed and beaming with anticipation. It was the kind of party that was typical of the neighborhood, an effortless display of wealth and casual sophistication. At the heart of the celebration was Julia, a woman of striking beauty and poised grace. She navigated through the clusters of friends and family, her laughter light and her demeanor perfect. Beside her, her husband, Mark, moved with a charming ease, his charismatic smile rarely fading as he shook hands and clapped backs. They were the perfect hosts, and to all appearances, the perfect couple. As the evening unfolded, Julia felt the familiar weight of her role. She was always the adored wife, the gracious hostess, the enviable partner to a successful man. Tonight, however, beneath the surface of her polished exterior, a nagging unease tugged at her. It was a whisper of doubt so faint it was almost imperceptible amid the clinking glasses and genteel laughter. When Mark squeezed her hand and leaned in to whisper a joke in her ear, she laughed, a bright, clear sound that matched the sparkle of her diamond earrings. Yet, as she turned to refill her drink, her smile faltered just slightly. The hall seemed to stretch longer and shadows seemed to loom a bit darker. She shook her head, dismissing the fleeting feeling as nothing more than fatigue. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew a little louder, a little more insistent. They were no longer just in her head. From the corner of her eye, she caught snippets of conversations, hushed tones that ceased abruptly when she approached. Friends who met her gaze just a moment too late, their expressions schooled into neutrality. Julia excused herself, slipping away from the throng under the pretext of needing a moment of quiet. In the solitude of the library, the whispers followed her, now echoing off the mahogany bookshelves filled with leather-bound classics and glossy travel books. She leaned against the cool wood of the desk, her heart beating a rhythm of rising panic. "Why are they whispering?" she murmured to herself, the question hanging in the air like the delicate chandelier overhead. Was it her imagination, fueled by exhaustion and perhaps a glass too many of champagne? Or was there something more, something lurking beneath the perfect image of her marriage, threatening to surface? With a deep breath, Julia straightened her spine and prepared to return to the party. But as she touched the doorknob, she paused. The whispers in the hall weren't just meaningless chatter, they were a warning, a sign that something in her perfectly constructed life was amiss. She opened the door slowly, a new determination settling in her chest. Tonight, she would start looking for answers. Chapter 2. A perfect facade. The party dwindled past midnight, leaving only the soft hum of the cleaning crew as they moved through Elmridge Manor. Julia stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister, watching the last of the guests make their way out. The laughter and warmth that had filled the halls just hours before now seemed like echoes from another time. She felt an unusual solitude as the door closed behind the final well-wishers, leaving her alone with Mark and the lingering whispers. Mark came up behind her, his hands finding her shoulders in a comforting embrace. "You were spectacular tonight, darling," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Thank you," she replied, managing a smile as she turned to face him. "Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves." "They did. You always throw the best parties." His grin was warm, genuine. But Julia's mind was elsewhere, tangled in the veiled glances and halted conversations she had noticed throughout the evening. As they retreated to their expansive bedroom, the silence between them felt charged, a stark contrast to the usual ease. Julia sat at the vanity, brushing her long hair with slow strokes, watching Mark in the reflection as he changed into his pajamas. "Is everything all right?" Mark finally asked, his brow furrowing slightly as he met her gaze in the mirror. Julia paused, the brush in mid-air. "Yes, of course. Just tired, I guess." Mark nodded, accepting her answer too quickly. He moved behind her, his hands gently massaging her shoulders. "You work too hard on these parties. You should rest." She leaned back into his touch, wanting to believe in the simple comfort it offered. Yet, her mind replayed the whispers, the looks. She wondered about the truths hidden behind the perfect facade of their life. Had she been naive all this time? The next morning, Julia rose early, the house still quiet. She made her way to the kitchen, a space she seldom used, preferring instead to leave the culinary efforts to their chef. Today, however, she needed the normalcy of making coffee, the simple routine grounding her swirling thoughts. As she waited for the brew, she noticed a piece of paper under a magnet on the fridge. It was a receipt for a jewelry store, dated 2 weeks ago, with an amount that suggested something far more lavish than any of her recent birthday gifts. Curiosity piqued, Julia folded the receipt and slipped it into her robe pocket. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with Mark absorbed in his phone, occasionally typing out messages. Julia watched him over her coffee cup, her mind racing. Who was he texting so early in the morning? Why hadn't he mentioned buying an expensive piece of jewelry? "Mark, have you planned any surprises lately?" she asked casually, trying to gauge his reaction. He looked up, his expression unreadable for a moment before a smooth smile took over. "Now, why would I ruin a surprise by telling you about it, love?" Julia laughed, a light, airy sound, but inside, her doubts solidified. The facade was cracking, and she needed to brace herself for what lay behind it. As Mark kissed her goodbye, heading off to work, Julia decided it was time to look beyond the surface of their perfect life. She needed to know if the life she lived with Mark was built on truth or lies. Chapter 3, Shadows of Doubt. The morning sun streamed through the high windows of Elmridge Manor, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Julia walked through the quiet halls, her mind a tempest of doubts and unanswered questions. The receipt she found kept burning in her pocket, a symbol of the secrets Mark might be hiding. She couldn't shake the feeling that the foundation of their marriage was not as solid as she had always believed. After Mark left for work, Julia made her way to their home office, a room filled with mahogany furniture and heavy books that spoke of Mark's taste for the traditional. She rarely ventured into this space, respecting it as Mark's private sanctuary. Today, however, she felt compelled to search for anything that might offer clues. Sitting at his desk, she opened drawers with a tentative touch, her heart pounding with each creak of the ancient wood. Bills, documents, and miscellaneous papers were stacked with meticulous care. Everything seemed ordinary, too ordinary, perhaps deliberately so. Then, tucked behind a stack of business magazines, Julia found an envelope with no markings. The heaviness of the paper suggested importance. Her fingers trembled as she slid out a card and a single rose petal fell onto her lap. The card was a reservation confirmation for a weekend getaway at a quaint vineyard 2 states away, a reservation for one. The date was set for next weekend. Julia's heart sank. They had no plans that she knew of, no discussions of any trips Mark had to take alone. Confusion swirled inside her like a dark cloud. Could there be a reasonable explanation? She pondered confronting him directly but feared his reaction. Not yet, she decided. Not until she understood more. Determined to find more concrete evidence, Julia visited the local branch of the bank that managed their accounts. She was a recognized face there, welcomed with the usual courtesies due to a valued client's wife. Requesting to see her joint accounts, she was led to a private room where she met with a financial advisor. "Mrs. Elmridge, how can we assist you today?" the advisor asked with a polite smile. "I'd like to review the recent transactions on both our personal and the business account," Julia stated, trying to sound casual. The advisor nodded, pulling up records on his computer. As they went through the transactions, Julia's eyes caught several large transfers to a consulting firm she had never heard of. The dates and amounts didn't match any business deals Mark had mentioned. Her request for details on the consulting firm was met with a professional, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Elmridge, but without Mr. Elmridge's authorization, I'm unable to provide more specific information about these transactions." Frustrated yet more suspicious than ever, Julia thanked the advisor and left the bank with a polite smile that masked her turmoil. The shadows of doubt were lengthening, and with each discovery, the sense of betrayal grew. She needed more answers, and she needed them soon. Driving back home, Julia's mind raced. The tranquility of their luxurious life felt like a veneer now, a thin layer of paint over a rotting wall. She realized that whatever Mark was hiding, it was not just a small oversight or a harmless secret. It was something big enough to potentially shatter their world. As she pulled into the driveway of Elmridge Manor, her decision was firm. She would find out everything, no matter how painful the truths turned out to be. Chapter 4, Mirrors and Smoke. The house was unnervingly silent as Julia entered, the secrets it held echoing louder in her mind than the tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer. She closed the door behind her with a soft click, her thoughts racing as she shed her coat and shoes. The air felt thick with unsaid words and the weight of her discoveries. She was now certain that Mark was entangled in something deceitful, something that could unravel their lives stitch by stitch. Determined to find more clues, Julia headed straight to their bedroom. This time, her search was more methodical. She sifted through Mark's drawers, checked his suit pockets, and looked behind books and inside his briefcase. Amidst the mundane, pens, notebooks, receipts for business lunches, a small, unassuming flash drive tucked in an inner pocket of his briefcase caught her eye. Her hands shook slightly as she grasped it, a lifeline in a sea of deception. With the flash drive in hand, Julia returned to the office. She plugged it into the computer, her heart pounding in anticipation. A list of files popped up, cryptic titles that offered no clues to their contents. She opened them one by one, her eyes scanning through emails and documents, searching for anything out of the ordinary. One document finally caught her attention. It was a series of email exchanges between Mark and a name she didn't recognize, discussing arrangements for the project with urgency and a tone of secrecy. The details were vague, coded almost, but it was clear that whatever this project was, it was something Mark had invested a lot of time and money into. Julia's mind reeled. What was Mark involved in? Was it illegal? Was it dangerous? Or was it simply unethical, a hidden aspect of his business he believed she wouldn't understand or approve of? As she delved deeper into the files, a small JPEG attachment in an email caught her eye. Hesitantly, she clicked on it, and an image slowly loaded on the screen. It was a photograph of Mark with the same unknown individual from the emails, both of them standing in front of a small, nondescript building. They were shaking hands, smiling, as if they had just sealed a deal. The date stamp on the photo was from a week ago. The location, however, was not mentioned, but the scenery was distinctly not from their city. Julia felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the depth of the lies. Mark had traveled recently, without her knowledge, to meet this mysterious partner. Confused and angry, Julia copied the pertinent files to her phone, unplugged the flash drive, and wiped her fingerprints from the computer as best she could. She needed time to think, to plan her next steps. Should she confront Mark directly? Should she seek help from someone else? Who could she trust? As she left the office, her reflection in the hallway mirror stopped her. The woman staring back seemed foreign, a far cry from the carefree, trusting wife she had been days ago. Her reflection was a mask of determination and fear, a visual reminder of the transformative power of truth. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Whatever Mark was hiding, Julia was ready to face it, no matter how it would alter their lives forever. She needed to know who the man she married really was, behind the mirrors and smoke of their seemingly perfect life. Chapter 5, The Weight of Silence. The next day, Julia awoke with the first faint light of dawn, her mind restless and heavy with thoughts. She lay in bed watching the sky turn from a deep navy to a soft grey, the silence of the morning pressing down on her with tangible weight. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft creaks of the aging manor, the gentle sigh of the wind through the trees outside. Yet within that silence was also the deafening quiet of secrecy, the stillness of a life paused at the brink of revelation. She rose, her body stiff from tension and lack of sleep, and dressed quickly. The image of the photograph she found, the one showing Mark with an unknown companion, played on loop in her mind. Today, she decided, would be the day she confronted him. She could not endure another moment of the torturous quiet, the endless questions with no answers. Breakfast was a silent affair, with Mark absorbed in his phone, and Julia picking at her food, her stomach knotted with anxiety. She watched him, noting every detail, the way his eyes flicked nervously around the room, how he tapped his foot under the table, a sign of his restlessness she had come to recognize over the years. "Mark," she began, her voice steadier than she felt, "we need to talk." He looked up, his expression one of mild surprise that poorly masked his underlying tension. "Of course," he replied, setting his phone aside. "What's on your mind?" "It's about your trips," she said, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Trips I wasn't aware of. And people you're meeting who I've never heard about." Mark's face hardened slightly, a subtle shift in his demeanor. "Julia, I don't know what you're—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I found the emails, Mark. And the photo. Who is he?" For a moment, Mark was silent, his jaw clenched. Then he sighed, a long, weary exhalation as if resigning himself to a fate he had long feared. "It's business, Julia. It's complicated business that I didn't want to worry you with. But why hide it? Why lie?" Julia's voice cracked with a mix of anger and hurt. "If it's just business, why not tell me?" "Because it's not just any business," he admitted, his voice low. "It's risky. And I wanted to protect you." "Protect me? By lying? By making me doubt everything about our life?" Julia's hands trembled, her heart aching with the betrayal. "I need the truth, Mark. All of it." Mark looked at her, his eyes weary and sad. "It's a deal that could either set us up for life or ruin us. I was trying to secure the former before you needed to worry about the latter." Julia felt her world tilt, the reality she knew slipping away. "And the trips? The secret meetings? I needed to handle this personally. It's sensitive, Julia. Too sensitive. I couldn't risk more exposure." Julia stood, her chair scraping back sharply. "I can't do this. Not like this." Her voice was cold, distant. "We're supposed to be partners, Mark. In everything. How can I trust you if you keep me in the shadows?" Mark reached out, his hand brushing hers, but she pulled away. "Please, let me explain everything." "I'll tell you everything," he pleaded. But Julia was already shaking her head, the decision firm in her mind. "I need some time, Mark. Time to think. To decide if I can live with this, or without you." Leaving Mark at the table, Julia grabbed her keys and headed for the door. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to be alone, away from the manor, the silence, and the weight of her crumbling trust. As she drove away, the early morning light seemed to mock her with its clarity, a stark contrast to the shadows in which she now found herself enveloped. Chapter 6. Fragments of truth. Julia drove without a clear destination, her mind a tumultuous sea of emotions. The roads were familiar, yet on this morning, they seemed to lead her into uncharted territories of her own life. Eventually, she found herself at the small lakeside park where she and Mark had often come in happier times. The tranquility of the place, with its gentle waves lapping at the shore and the soft rustling of leaves, stood in stark contrast to the storm within her. She walked to the edge of the water, the early morning mist cool on her face. Seated on a weathered bench, Julia allowed herself a moment of weakness, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. How could so many years of marriage come to this? A web of lies and half-truths. She felt betrayed, Yet part of her still longed to believe there was a reason, a good reason, for Mark's secrecy. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, a message from Mark. "Please come home so we can talk. I owe you all the truth." Julia stared at the screen, indecision gripping her. Could she face him now, or did she need more time to sort through the debris of her shattered trust? After a long while, she stood and took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to face the situation head-on. With a determined stride, she returned to her car and drove back to Elmridge Manor. Chapter 7. Secrets in the walls. As Julia approached the grand facade of their home, the house seemed to stare back at her with 1,000 eyes, each window reflecting her fractured emotions. She entered, finding Mark waiting for her in the living room, his face a mask of remorse. "I'm glad you're back," he began, his voice tentative. Julia sat opposite him, her posture stiff. "Start talking, Mark. I want the truth. All of it." Mark took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly together. "It started about a year ago," he began, his voice steady but filled with a palpable tension. "I was approached by an old business acquaintance with an opportunity. It was risky, yes, but the rewards, they were more than we could have ever imagined." Julia listened, her expression unreadable. "Go on." "It involved some unconventional investments. Offshore accounts, cryptocurrency, things I knew you wouldn't want to be involved with or worry about. I wanted to protect you from the risk, from the stress." "And the man in the photo?" Julia's voice was sharp. "He's a consultant, specializing in these kinds of investments. We met several times, discussing strategies, potential outcomes. Everything had to be done with a level of confidentiality that I'd never dealt with before." Julia shook her head, the pieces of the puzzle slowly fitting together but leaving her more confused about her feelings. "And you thought it best to keep this from me? To lie?" Mark looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I could make everything work, I could spare you the burden of knowing how precarious it was." Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. Julia finally spoke, her voice a whisper. "But you weren't just protecting me from the business risks, were you? You were protecting yourself. From my judgment, from my potential refusal." Mark nodded, the truth in her words undeniable. "I was afraid of losing you," he admitted. Julia stood, her decision clear in her mind. "You may have lost me anyway," she said, her voice calm but cold. "I need time, Mark. Time away from this house, from these secrets." As she turned to leave, Mark reached out, a plea in his eyes. "Julia, please." She paused, her heart torn between the love of the man she once knew and the stranger before her now. "I will think about it, Mark. That's all I can promise right now." Leaving Mark in the silence of the room, Julia walked upstairs to pack a few essentials. Elmridge Manor, once a symbol of their shared dreams, now felt like a house of cards, fragile and hollow with secrets. As she zipped her suitcase, she knew the road ahead would be difficult, but necessary, a journey towards healing or perhaps an inevitable end. Chapter 8. Ties that bind. Julia drove away from Elmridge Manor, the rearview mirror framing the house as it shrank into the distance, a symbol of the life she was leaving behind, if only temporarily. She headed towards her sister's house in the neighboring town, a refuge she knew would offer not just comfort but a listening ear and the kind of honest advice she desperately needed. Her sister, Eleanor, greeted her at the door with a knowing look and a warm embrace. "I was wondering when I'd see you," Eleanor said softly, leading her into the cozy kitchen where the aroma of fresh coffee filled the air. "You look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders." Julia managed a small smile as she accepted a mug from Eleanor. They sat at the kitchen table, the familiar and comforting patterns of the tablecloth and the gentle ticking of the clock on the wall enveloping her in a sense of normalcy. "It's Mark," Julia began, her voice faltering. "There are things. I've found out things that I don't know how to handle." Eleanor's expression turned serious. "What kind of things?" Julia recounted the discoveries she had made, from the secretive business deals to the hidden trips and the cryptic messages. As she spoke, the weight of her silence lifted slightly, the words bringing a sort of reality to her fears that she hadn't fully accepted until now. Eleanor listened intently, her brow furrowed in concern. "What are you going to do?" she asked when Julia had finished. "I don't know," Julia admitted, her hands wrapped tightly around the warm mug. "I love him, Ellie, but I don't know if I can trust him again. Not after this." Eleanor reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Trust is like a mirror," she said gently. "Once it's shattered, you can put it back together, but the cracks will always show." The analogy struck a chord in Julia, the truth of it settling in her heart. "I need time to think, to decide what those cracks mean for us, for our future." "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need," Eleanor offered. "Sometimes, distance is the best clarity." Julia nodded, grateful for the sanctuary her sister provided. The days that followed were a mixture of introspection and long conversations. Eleanor provided both comfort and challenge, pushing Julia to consider not just her marriage but what she wanted from her life, independent of her relationship with Mark. One afternoon, as they walked through the local park, Eleanor posed a question that stopped Julia in her tracks. "If you could decide right now, without any consequences, would you leave him or stay?" Julia paused, looking out over the lake, its surface a mirror reflecting the cloudy sky above. "I don't know," she confessed, the honesty of her uncertainty ringing truer than any reassurance she could have offered herself. "That's okay," Eleanor responded. "You don't need to have all the answers right now. Just remember, whatever decision you make it for you, not just for the marriage or for him." Julia spent the following days in a reflective silence, weighing her love against her hurt, the bonds of her marriage against the freedom of her individuality. As the days turned into a week, she knew the time was coming soon to make a choice, to either mend what was broken or to start anew, alone but whole. The ties that bound her to Mark were strong, but the ties to herself were stronger, and she was slowly realizing that her happiness might depend on acknowledging that strength. Chapter 9. Echoes of the Past. Julia spent the following days wandering through a landscape of memories, each one tainted with the shadow of recent revelations. Eleanor's house, with its comforting familiarity and gentle rhythms, provided the backdrop for her introspection. She found herself in the attic one afternoon, a place filled with boxes of old photographs and letters, remnants of their shared childhood. As Julia sifted through the dusty memories, she came across a box labeled simply Summers at Lake Marin. Inside were photographs of her and Eleanor as teenagers, their youthful faces alight with carefree smiles. She paused over a picture of herself, standing on the dock, sunlight dappling her hair, her eyes bright with unguarded dreams. It struck her how much she had changed, how much of her own essence she had compromised in her attempts to fit into Mark's world. She dug deeper, finding a letter she had written to herself as a young woman, a tradition Eleanor had started. "Dear future me," it read, "I hope you are still chasing your dreams, still standing up for what you believe in, and still loving with your whole heart. Never let anyone make you feel like you are not enough." Tears welled in Julia's eyes as she read her own words. How could she have forgotten this girl, this version of herself who was so full of hope and conviction? The letter was like a message from the past, urging her to reclaim those parts of herself that she had lost along the way. That evening, over dinner, Julia shared her discovery with Eleanor. "I found this letter I wrote to myself," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It made me realize how much I've changed, how much I've let go." Eleanor listened, her face lined with empathy. "We all change, Jules," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean we have to lose ourselves. Maybe this is your chance to find that girl again, to bring her dreams and her strength back into your life." Julia nodded, the resolve in her heart growing stronger. "I think it's time I made some decisions. Hard ones, maybe, but necessary." The sisters spent the night talking, reminiscing about their childhood, and discussing Julia's future. It was a cathartic experience, one that brought both pain and clarity. By the end of it, Julia felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was ready to face whatever came next, armed with the knowledge of her own worth and the unconditional support of her sister. As the night deepened, Julia sat alone by the window, looking out at the starlit sky. The echoes of her past had merged with the present, reminding her that she was still that hopeful girl at heart, even if life had temporarily made her forget. Tomorrow, she decided, she would return to Elmridge Manor. She would confront Mark with all she had learned, not just about his secrets, but about herself. She would demand the truth, and from there, they would either rebuild or part ways. But either outcome would be on her terms, guided by the rediscovered truths of her own heart. Chapter 10. Broken Promises. Julia's drive back to Elmridge Manor was filled with a mixture of trepidation and determination. The landscape rolled by, each mile bringing her closer to a confrontation that would likely alter the course of her life, for better or for worse. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would say it, and all the possible responses Mark might have. But nothing could truly prepare her for the moment she would step through those doors into the uncertain future of their marriage. The manor loomed large as she pulled into the drive, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the lawn. Julia took a deep breath before entering, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, the house was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath along with her. Mark was in the study, looking out over the grounds. He turned as she entered, his expression one of surprise and concern. "Julia," he said, his voice cautious. "You're back." "I am," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. "We need to talk, Mark. Really talk. No more secrets, no more lies." Mark nodded slowly, motioning for her to sit. Instead, Julia chose to remain standing, needing the strength her posture lent her. "I went to Eleanor's," she began. "I needed some space to think, to understand what's been happening between us." "I understand," Mark said, his voice low. "And I'm sorry, for everything." Julia shook her head slightly. "Sorry isn't enough this time, Mark. I found out about the investments, the risks you've been taking without telling me. And I can't help but wonder, what else haven't you told me? What other promises have you broken?" Mark's gaze dropped to the floor before he met her eyes again. "I wanted to protect you from the stress, from the danger of it all. I thought I was doing the right thing. But it wasn't your decision to make alone," Julia countered. "I'm your wife, not a child you need to shield from reality. We made vows, Mark, to share our lives, our decisions." "I know," Mark admitted, his voice breaking with emotion. "And I failed you. I let my fear of losing everything cloud my judgment. I was wrong." Julia felt a pang of sorrow for the man she loved, so flawed and so desperately lost. "And what now?" she asked softly. "Where do we go from here?" "I will tell you everything," Mark promised, standing to join her. "Every detail, no more secrets. And then, you decide. Whether you want to stay and rebuild this with me, or leave. I'll understand, whatever you choose." The conversation that followed lasted into the early hours of the morning. Mark revealed everything about his business dealings, the financial strains, the pressures that had driven him to make such desperate choices. Julia listened, absorbing it all, her heart torn between the love she still felt and the breach of trust that seemed insurmountable. As dawn broke over Elmridge Manor, Julia stood by the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. She felt broken yet strangely whole, as if the truth, however painful, had freed a part of her soul. "I need time," she finally said, turning to Mark, who looked back at her with a weary, hopeful gaze. "Time to think about all of this, to decide if I can forgive, if we can start again. It's not just about love, Mark. It's about trust, respect, and equality." Mark nodded, the relief and pain mingled on his face. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I'll be here, Julia. I'll be waiting." With those words hanging between them, Julia left the room. The future was uncertain, the promises of the past broken, but the promise of a new beginning, however fragile, lingered in the morning air. Chapter 11. Crossing lines. In the days that followed, Julia found herself in a state of liminal existence, walking the tightrope between her past affections and the stark realities of her present. Each morning she woke in the guest bedroom of Elmridge Manor, a space she had chosen for its distance from the shared quarters that now felt too intimate, too laden with memories. She spent her days in long solitary walks on the grounds, the expansive gardens providing a refuge where she could think without walls to remind her of what was crumbling inside them. Occasionally, Mark would join her, always respectful of her space, their conversations tentative and careful, like two diplomats on the verge of a treaty. One afternoon, as autumn leaves danced in a chilly breeze, Julia stood by the old stone bridge that arched over a small creek. The water below mirrored a tumultuous sky, and she watched the reflections break with each ripple. It seemed a metaphor for her marriage, how the smallest disturbances had fractured the calm surface, revealing the chaotic depths beneath. As she reflected, Mark approached, his steps hesitant. "Julia," he began, stopping a respectful distance away. "I've been thinking about everything you said, about trust, respect, and equality. I've contacted a counselor, someone who specializes in financial infidelity. I want to understand why I did what I did, and how to mend it, if you're willing." Julia turned to face him, surprised by his initiative but guarded against the hopeful stirring in her heart. "That's a good start, Mark. I'm glad you're taking steps. But I'm still figuring out my own path." Mark nodded, his face a canvas of mixed emotions. "I know, and I'll wait, as long as you need. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm committed to doing the work, to changing." Their conversation drifted then to more mundane matters, the price of normalcy they both paid willingly. It was easier to discuss the repairs needed on the garden walls or the upcoming charity event than to tread again into the turbulent waters of their relationship. That evening, as Julia sat in the library surrounded by books, a testament to centuries of thoughts and theories penned down, she opened her laptop and began researching. Not just on financial infidelity, but on rebuilding trust, on healing. She read articles, forums, and expert opinions, her mind a sponge thirsty for understanding, for guidance. It struck her then how proactive she needed to be in her own healing, whether or not her marriage survived. She decided to seek her own counselor, someone who could help her navigate her feelings of betrayal and her journey towards either reconciliation or independence. Days turned into weeks, and the manor bore witness to the subtle changes between its master and mistress. They were like two planets in the same orbit, drawn together by gravity yet separated by space, each spinning in their own sphere of personal growth and reflection. As the season changed, bringing with it the first frost that glistened on the grass at dawn, Julia felt a clarity beginning to emerge from the fog of her emotions. She was not ready to make a decision about her marriage, but she was taking steps, crossing lines she had drawn long ago, lines between her heart and her sense of self, between forgiveness and self-respect. She wrote in her journal one night, a habit she had picked up as part of her therapy: "Healing is not linear, nor is it tied to the person who hurt you. It is a journey back to yourself, and perhaps forward to a new horizon." As she penned those words, Julia understood that no matter what the future held, she was crossing lines that would lead her to a stronger, more whole version of herself. And that was a journey worth taking, no matter where it led. Chapter 12, Unveiling the Masquerade. As the leaves shed their vibrant hues, surrendering to the muted tones of late autumn, Julia's internal landscape mirrored the change. Each day brought a new layer of understanding, a deeper insight into her own resilience and the intricate dance of forgiveness. She wasn't ready to fully forgive Mark, but she had begun to forgive herself for not seeing the signs, for losing parts of herself in the marriage. One crisp morning, Julia decided to visit the local art gallery, a place she had often gone to clear her mind before the chaos had unfolded. As she wandered through the quiet halls, her eyes were drawn to a series of paintings depicting scenes of transformation. Each brushstroke told a story of change, of shedding old forms and embracing new ones. It resonated deeply with her, the art echoing her own transformation. Returning home, she found Mark waiting for her in the kitchen, a tentative smile on his face. "I've been doing some thinking," he started, his voice carrying a note of hope mixed with apprehension. "And talking with the counselor. About everything, especially about transparency and honesty. Julia set down her purse, her posture open but cautious. "And what have you uncovered?" Mark took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers squarely. "That I've been wearing a mask, not just with you but with myself. I've been so wrapped up in appearing successful, in controlling everything, that I lost sight of what truly matters. I lost sight of us, of you." The sincerity in his words touched Julia, but she remained guarded. "It's good that you're seeing these things. It's important. I know it doesn't change what I did," Mark continued, his voice steady. "But I want to start making amends. I want to rebuild our trust, no matter how long it takes." Julia nodded, appreciating his efforts but knowing the road ahead was long. Trust has to be rebuilt step by step. It's not just about the big revelations, but also the small moments, the daily choices. "I understand," Mark said, a flicker of determination lighting his features. "And I'm ready for that. I want to be an open book from now on. Starting with this." He handed her an envelope. Inside, Julia found a detailed account of all his financial dealings, including those he had previously hidden. As she read, Mark explained each entry, his voice devoid of the defensiveness that had once characterized such discussions. It was a raw, honest exchange, and by the end, Julia felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps they could slowly peel away the layers of deceit, perhaps there was a foundation worth salvaging. That evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, the atmosphere was reflective, tinged with a cautious optimism. Afterward, they took a walk in the fading light, their steps slow, their conversation flowing more freely than it had in months. "It feels like we're starting to peel off the masks," Julia said, her voice soft but clear in the dusk. "Yes," Mark agreed, reaching for her hand, a gesture she did not pull away from. "And I hope, with time, we can leave them off for good." As they walked back to the house, Julia felt the weight of her thoughts lighten slightly. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with potential setbacks and challenges, but for the first time in a long while, it seemed worth navigating. The masquerade was ending, and what was left was raw, real, and fragile, but it was theirs to rebuild. Chapter 13. The cost of lies. The crisp chill of early winter settled over Elmridge Manor as if to mark a new beginning, or perhaps to signify the end of an era. Julia found the cold invigorating. It mirrored the clarity she felt growing within her day by day. Each morning brought a sharper focus, a deeper sense of her own desires and decisions. She resumed some of her old routines, rekindling her love for painting, a hobby she had put aside during the years of her marriage where other priorities had taken over. As she painted, she realized how much of herself she had muted, her canvas a reflection of her reclaimed vibrancy. Mark noticed the change in her too. He supported her rekindled passions, often standing quietly by her easel, watching her work with a mix of admiration and regret. "I forgot how much you loved this," he remarked one evening, his voice laced with remorse. Julia paused, her brush in mid-air, turning to face him with a contemplative gaze. "I forgot too. But I'm remembering now." The distance between them had begun to close, not just through conversations and shared silences but through these small acknowledgments of past neglects and oversights. It was in these moments that Julia saw the sincere changes in Mark, his efforts not just to amend the past but to understand and appreciate the woman she was. However, Julia still attended sessions with her counselor, a grounding experience that helped her navigate her mixed emotions. During one session, she expressed her cautious optimism. "I see his changes, his effort. It's like he's really trying to understand what went wrong, not just patch it up." "That's a good sign," her counselor noted. "But remember, healing is not just about the other person changing. It's about how these changes resonate with you, how they align with what you need and want." Julia nodded, taking in these words. Her own journey was about more than reconciling with Mark. It was about reconciling with herself, with the parts of her that had been silenced or set aside. One afternoon, Julia and Mark sat together in the library, surrounded by the musty scent of old books and the warmth of a crackling fireplace. They had begun to make this a regular part of their routine, using the time to talk openly about their thoughts and feelings. During one of these sessions, Mark turned to her with a serious look. "I know we've been rebuilding, and I'm thankful for every moment you've given us to work through this. But I also know this might not erase what I've done, the trust I've broken." Julia listened, her heart a complex tapestry of love, hurt, and hope. "It doesn't erase it, Mark. But it matters that you're trying. It matters that you're here, not running from the difficult parts." Mark reached out, taking her hand gently. "I'm here for as long as you'll have me, for as long as it takes." As they sat together, the shadows of their past seemed to mingle with the light of the fire, creating a dance of flickering hopes and fears on the walls. Julia knew there were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The cost of the lies was high, the damage real. But the work they were doing, the honesty and the raw vulnerability they were sharing, was weaving a new tapestry in their marriage. Whether this tapestry would be strong enough to hold them together in the years to come remained to be seen. But for now, Julia was committed to the process, to discovering the full cost of the lies, and perhaps, the full value of the truth. Chapter 14, A Crumbling Foundation. As winter deepened, the cold outside mirrored the slow, sometimes painful thawing of tensions within Elmridge Manor. Julia and Mark continued their tentative dance of reconciliation, each step measured and fraught with the memory of past missteps. Despite the progress, Julia often found herself grappling with waves of doubt. Was rebuilding truly possible, or were they merely patching up a structure doomed to fail? One evening, as they sat before the fireplace, a session led by their therapist via video call stirred the settled dust of their relationship. The therapist, Dr. Ames, had a gentle but direct way of probing the depths of their communication and trust issues. "Mark, can you share with Julia what you feel has been the biggest change in you since all this came to light?" Dr. Ames asked, his voice firm over the speakers. Mark paused, his expression thoughtful. "I think it's been my understanding of honesty. Before, I thought honesty was about not lying, but now I see it's also about being open, about sharing even the parts of myself I'm scared to show." Julia listened, her heart a mix of hope and skepticism. "And how does that change how you relate to Julia?" "It means I'm trying to bring my true self to our relationship, not just the parts one thinks she wants to see," Mark replied, turning to look at her with earnest eyes. Dr. Ames nodded, then turned to Julia. "And Julia, how does that resonate with you? Do you feel these changes?" Julia hesitated, the weight of her next words heavy on her tongue. "I see the changes, I do. And part of me is grateful, relieved. But there's another part that's waiting. Waiting to see if the foundation we're rebuilding is solid, or if it's still crumbling beneath us." The words hung in the air, a silent echo of the fear that perhaps not all fractures could be mended. Dr. Ames leaned forward, his face serious. "That's a valid fear, Julia. Rebuilding trust is like reconstructing a house. The foundation has to be solid, or everything else will eventually collapse." The session ended with assignments for both to reflect on what they truly needed from each other to fortify this new foundation. As the screen went dark, the room felt suddenly colder, the fire's warmth not quite reaching the corners where shadows lingered. The following days were introspective for Julia. She took long walks on the frost-hardened paths of their estate, her steps crunching over the icy gravel, her breath a misty cloud in the air. She thought about foundations, what they were made of, how they were tested, and when they were deemed beyond repair. One morning, while walking, she stopped by the old summer house, its structure worn but standing resilient against the biting wind. As she touched the cold, rough wood, she realized that resilience was not just about withstanding storms, it was about allowing oneself to be fortified by them. Returning to the house, Julia felt a decision forming, clear and sharp as the winter air. That evening, she spoke to Mark with a calm certainty. "I want us to keep working, both together and individually. I'm committed to this process, but I need us to be honest about our expectations and our fears. This isn't just about staying together. It's about whether we can grow together, not just back to what we were but into something stronger. Mark listened, his face a mixture of relief and resolve. I agree. And whatever it takes, I'm here. I want to be part of something real, something honest. I want to grow, with you. Their conversation that night didn't solve everything. Deep-seated fears and hurts didn't dissolve at once. But it laid down a marker, a commitment to test and hopefully strengthen their foundation, together. Chapter 15, Revelations. The weeks following Julia and Mark's commitment to growth brought a quiet energy to Elmridge Manor. They both engaged in individual therapy, while also taking joint sessions that often opened more layers of their past and hopes for the future. As the days grew incrementally longer, signaling the approach of spring, so too did the light of understanding begin to seep more fully into the corners of their relationship. During one particularly poignant joint therapy session, Dr. Ames introduced a concept that resonated deeply with Julia. Think of your relationship as a garden, he suggested. It needs regular tending, yes, but also the right conditions to thrive. Sometimes, that means reevaluating what you've planted, understanding what works and what doesn't, and not being afraid to uproot the things that no longer serve you. This metaphor struck a chord with Julia. Later that week, she spent a day in the actual gardens of Elmridge, her hands deep in the soil, planting new bulbs and uprooting weeds that had overrun parts of the garden beds. Each bulb was a promise to the future, a symbol of renewal and growth, while each weed removed made space for more light, more air, more life. Inspired by this day of gardening, Julia decided to create a special dinner for Mark, one that would celebrate the new growth in their lives. She spent the afternoon cooking, preparing dishes that were both of their favorites, blending their tastes and preferences much like they were learning to blend their new realities and expectations. That evening, as they sat down to the candlelit table, Julia felt a warmth in her heart that had been absent for a long time. I spent today in the garden, she began, sharing the reflections the day had brought her. It made me think about what we're trying to do here, how we're trying to grow something new, something healthy. Mark listened intently, his eyes reflecting the candlelight and something more, perhaps hope. I like that, he said. It feels hopeful, like we're not just trying to fix something broken but trying to cultivate something better. The conversation that night meandered through various topics, some light, some serious. They discussed their individual progress in therapy, their insights and challenges, and how these individual journeys were contributing to a healthier dynamic between them. As dessert was served, a homemade apple pie that filled the room with its sweet aroma, Julia leaned forward, a spark of spontaneity in her expression. I have an idea, she said, her voice tinged with excitement. What if we started a new tradition? Every spring, we could spend a day in the garden together, planting new things, planning for the future. It could be our way of marking our progress, our growth. Mark smiled, his eyes lighting up at the idea. I love that. It's a celebration of new beginnings, every year. A reminder of where we've come from and where we're heading. They ended the evening with a walk around the estate, the night air crisp and invigorating. It was clear, filled with stars, each one shining down like a silent witness to the changes they were forging together. As they walked, their hands found each other's, a simple gesture laden with meaning. In that moment, Julia felt a revelation settle within her, a realization that their efforts to heal and grow were not just about salvaging their marriage but about deepening their understanding of themselves and each other. It was about cultivating a life together that was as deliberate and tended as the garden they would grow. Chapter 16. Picking up the pieces. Spring brought with it a renewal that permeated Elmridge Manor both inside and out. The gardens began to burst with the colors of new blooms, a vivid testament to the transformative power of care and attention. Inside, Julia and Mark continued to nurture the fragile sprouts of their relationship, encouraged by the visible changes in their environment. One sunny morning, Julia stood by the open window of her studio, where she had recently started painting again. She was working on a piece inspired by the manor's gardens, a vibrant mix of colors and textures that reflected the complexity and beauty of renewal. As she added a stroke to the canvas, she realized how much painting had become a metaphor for her own emotional journey. Each color, each line, represented a part of her life, intertwined and overlapping, sometimes chaotic, but ultimately creating a harmonious whole. Mark entered quietly, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You look like you're in your element," he remarked, a note of admiration in his voice. Julia turned, a smile spreading across her face. "I feel like it, too. It's been too long since I've felt this way, connected, purposeful." Mark nodded, his gaze lingering on the canvas. "It's beautiful. Like us, it's getting there, piece by piece." The analogy wasn't lost on Julia. She wiped her hands on a cloth and stepped closer to him. "I've been thinking about those pieces," she said thoughtfully. "About how we're trying to put them back together. It's delicate work, isn't it? Requiring patience and a lot of care." "Yes, and every piece matters," Mark added. "Even the small ones, especially those. They make the picture complete." Encouraged by this shared understanding, they decided to spend the afternoon sorting through old photo albums, an activity they had avoided since the turmoil began. As they turned each page, memories, both joyful and painful, surfaced, and they talked about each one, sharing their perspectives, sometimes seeing the moments in new lights. This process, though emotional, proved cathartic. It was as if by revisiting their past openly, with all its flaws and beauty, they were able to reclaim their story, to see it as a continuum rather than a series of disjointed chapters. Later that day, while walking through the blooming garden, Julia suggested an idea that had been forming in her mind. "What if we start a new photo album?" she proposed. "One that begins now, with pictures of the garden, of my paintings, of us, today. We could call it renewal or regrowth." Mark's response was an immediate and enthusiastic agreement. "Let's do it. It's like marking a new beginning, a way to document our progress and remind us of where we've come from and where we're going." As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the ground, elongating their figures until they seemed to stride not just across the lawn but also towards a hopeful horizon. That evening, as they placed the first new photos in their album, a snapshot of Julia in her studio, Mark reading by the fire, and several vibrant pictures of the garden, Julia felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't just about picking up the pieces of their broken relationship, it was about creating something new, something perhaps even more beautiful because of the understanding and growth that had come from their struggles. In this light, the future seemed not just a promise but a certainty, a canvas awaiting their renewed creativity and love to bring it to life. Chapter 17. A new dawn. The renewal at Elmridge Manor was palpable as the spring unfolded into early summer. The gardens thrived under Julia and Mark's combined care, each bloom a testament to their dedication to growth, both in the soil and in their relationship. Inside the house, the atmosphere was lighter, the air charged with a hopeful expectancy that perhaps the hardest part of their journey was behind them. One particularly warm morning, Julia proposed an idea that had been germinating in her mind for weeks. Over breakfast, she looked across the table at Mark, who seemed more present and engaged than he had been in years. "I've been thinking about how far we've come," she started, her voice tinged with a mixture of pride and nervous excitement. "What do you think about renewing our vows? Not as a reenactment of our past commitments, but as a reaffirmation of what we've learned and who we are now." Mark paused, his spoon midway to his mouth, clearly taken by surprise. Slowly, he set it down, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds perfect," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "A way to mark this new chapter. I love it." Encouraged by his response, Julia spent the next several weeks planning. They decided on a small ceremony in the garden, under the archway of climbing roses that had been part of Elmridge's original landscaping, a symbol of enduring beauty and resilience. As the day approached, Julia found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. She wrote her vows in the quiet of her studio, surrounded by her paintings. Each word she penned was infused with the lessons of forgiveness, the beauty of patience, and the strength found in vulnerability. The day of the vow renewal was clear and sunny, with just a hint of a breeze. The garden was in full bloom, awash with colors and fragrances that filled the air with a natural perfume. A small group of close friends and family gathered, each one aware of the couple's trials and their triumph in navigating through them. Julia walked down the garden path alone, a choice she had made to symbolize her journey of self-discovery and independence. Mark waited under the rose arch, his eyes brimming with tears as he watched her approach. There was a softness between them, a gentle understanding of each other's flaws and strengths that had not been there in their earlier years. As they exchanged vows, their voices steady but charged with deep emotion, it was clear to all who witnessed that these were not just words but promises carved from the depths of hard-earned wisdom. "I promise to cherish our relationship, to nurture it as we have nurtured our beloved garden," Julia vowed, her eyes locked on Mark's. "And I promise to keep our bond transparent, to remain open and honest, as we stand not just as husband and wife but as true partners," Mark responded, his hand squeezing hers. After the ceremony, as the guests mingled and dined on light summer fare, the couple stole a moment to themselves by the garden pond. Reflecting on the day, Mark took Julia's hand in his. "Today feels like a new dawn," he said, the golden sunlight casting a warm glow over them. Julia nodded, her heart full. "A new dawn indeed," she agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Built on the old but with a new light guiding us." As they stood together, the water of the pond reflecting their joined silhouettes, the future seemed not just a continuation but a rebirth, an era to look forward to, filled with the promise of continued growth, understanding, and love.